The emperor had sent Monsieur de Montholon, who was the son-in-law of Senator Semonville, to Würzburg as plenipotentiary minister, because, as he thought, the court of the Grand Duke would be to the French envoy a mirror in which he could see the reflection of all that was going on in Vienna. Prince Ferdinand of Austria, formerly Grand Duke of Tuscany, who had been dispossessed of his states by the Treaty of Luneville, had obtained in exchange for the Duchy of Salzburg the Grand Duchy of Würzburg in virtue of a clause of the Treaty of 1809. He had come to Paris as a member of the Confederation of the Rhine to be present at the marriage of his niece, Marie-Louise. He stayed rather long time in Paris and lived in the intimacy of the imperial family and court. The object for which Monsieur de Montholon was sent was to a certain extent realized, for the new ambassador gave useful information on the internal state of things in Austrian Germany. Count Montholon had passed through a brilliant military career, his services previous to the day of Brumaire 18th, and his cooperation on that same day had been recompensed with the gift of the Sword of Honor. He was obliged to renounce his military career temporarily in consequence of wounds and bad health. He then became chamberlain to the emperor and was entrusted with various missions in which he knew how to display his skill. His diplomatic career was, however, suddenly interrupted by a marriage which displeased Napoleon. General Montholon, as a matter of fact, during his visit to Würzburg, and without the knowledge of his family, married a woman who had been twice divorced and whose two husbands were still living. The emperor had refused his consent to this marriage, but during a stay in Dresden, he granted Monsieur Montholon permission to marry the niece of President Séguier, because he had forgotten that the lady in question was the identical person whose marriage he had refused to authorize. Napoleon, however, was soon made acquainted with the true state of things and refused to allow the divorced woman to be presented at the court of Würzburg. And this out of consideration for the susceptibility of the small German courts, which in this case, at least, was very excusable. General Montholon, in consequence, was ordered to retire immediately from his place and to return to Paris forthwith. The emperor's resentment, however, was not long-lived. Count Montholon very soon re-entered the service and was entrusted with the command of a department. On Napoleon's return from the island of Elba, this faithful servant made haste to go and meet him, attached himself entirely to his person, and in the end, together with his wife and children, followed him to St. Helena, where, until the very end, he gave the emperor touching proofs of the most absolute devotion. Before leaving Paris, the emperor, according to his custom, had dispatched all matters which were behindhand, or which were awaiting his decision. He had established an order of service in virtue of which the government was confided during the absence to the Council of Ministers, presided over by the Arch-Chancellor Cambyses. An auditor charged with the minister's portfolio was sent each week to the minister, Secretary of State, who always accompanied the emperor. The Minister of Police himself wrote every day. Napoleon also used to receive confidential letters or notes from persons who were not employed in the government, but who were authorized or permitted to write to him, as the readers have seen, on matters of home politics, on the state of the public opinion, and even on literary subjects. Although distant 800 or 900 leagues from Paris, Napoleon governed the empire as though he were present. The empress was at that time only charged with the representative part of the functions. She used to go to Mass every Sunday, and all persons who had been presented at court were allowed to be present on these occasions. After Mass, she used to walk around the gallery, which led into the chapel, and converse with everybody present. She used also to receive on certain grand occasions. At such times, her timidity was noticeable, and the efforts which she made to surmount this timidity gave her an embarrassed bearing. The persons of both sexes whose names were registered on the lists of entrees were admitted every evening to her receptions. It was the emperor who had drawn up this list, and he had taken care to select persons who were agreeable to the Empress. The consequence was that at these drawing rooms she was perfectly at her ease and did the honors with much grace and natural manners. She used to play at billiards with persons whom she selected. Whist tables were set up for form in her drawing room, and the evenings terminated with a concert or theatrical performance. On May 9th, 1812, the Emperor and Empress left St. Cloud and arrived at Mayence on the 14th, where they stayed. Their Majesties saw the Grand Duke and Grand Duchess of Hesse-Darmstadt. The journey from Mayence to Dresden was one unbroken, triumphal procession, and the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine, whose states were passed through by the French sovereigns, received them as their suzerains and showed them the hospitality of grand vassals. Many even came to wait for them on the road, amongst others the King of Württemberg and the Grand Duke of Baden. It would be a mistake to fancy that the emperor expected his hosts to pay for his entertainment and that of his suite. Napoleon did not wish his visits to give trouble to anybody. He was preceded and followed by his household, together with all that was necessary for a life of great display. Some leagues from Dresden he met the King of Saxony, who had come to meet him, accompanied by his queen. The Emperor and Empress made their entrance into Dresden with their Saxon majesties by torchlight. On the morrow, the Emperor and Empress of Austria and the Archdukes also arrived at Dresden and were followed in turn by the Queen of Westphalia. The king had already gone to join the army. The Grand Duke of Würzburg, the King and Crown Prince of Prussia, and many of the princes of the Confederation, the principal ministers, and amongst others, Messieurs de Hardenberg and Metternich. The Emperor Francis embraced Napoleon with visible emotion. The Empress of Austria and the Archdukes received Marie-Louise with an ardor which was mingled with respect. The King of Prussia presented the Crown Prince to the Emperor and begged him to allow him to follow him as aide-de-camp, and at the same time begged the Emperor's aides-de-camp to bestow their friendship on his son. The period of Napoleon's stay in Dresden in 1812 marks the apogee of his power. Words are wanting to describe the effect which his presence produced there. Never, perhaps, has human greatness reached so high a point. It has been said that Napoleon at Dresden was the Agamemnon, King of Kings. It was to his intellectual superiority almost as much as to his power at that time. These spontaneous manifestations of respect and consideration were addressed. An emperor, kings, and sovereign princes stood at his side as courtiers rather than as peers. The Emperor of Austria was forgotten in Napoleon's presence, and the latter had to efface himself to draw attention to a prince whose illustrious son-in-law centered all attention on himself. It must not be judged from their attitude that the Emperor of Austria and the King of Prussia were sincere in their demonstrations towards the man who had conquered them. If these princes had been able, for the moment, to forget their secret grudges, they had near their persons clever ministers who would have taken it upon themselves to remind them of their grievances. The Empress of Austria, a well-read and intelligent woman, came to Dresden armed with her dignity as a beautiful woman and as an empress, full of prejudices against the man to whom the Austrian monarchy owed its greatest humiliation. Marie-Louise's young stepmother came determined to resist the general enthusiasm and to hold herself in a reserve which should fringe on contempt. In a very short time, she had yielded to the influence which Napoleon exercised on all. I had frequent opportunities of observing the aspect of these august assemblies, and I have contemplated the royal assembly of which Napoleon was the head, in the vast apartment of the palace at Dresden. The Empress of Austria was in such poor health that she was unable to support the fatigue of walking a long distance in the apartment. The emperor used to go to meet her, holding his hat in one hand, the other hand resting on the door of the sedan chair in which the empress was being carried, talking to her in a cheerful manner. The Empress seemed to take an interest in his conversation and showed her interest by the attention with which she listened to and answered him. All those who were present at these moments agree in saying that Napoleon exercised an irresistible ascendancy over his noble hosts, as much by the agreeableness of his wit as by the seduction of his manners. One might have said that this extraordinary man had, since his youth, carried the weight of a great empire on his shoulders. So well did he know how to support the dignity of his rank, by his tone and by his manners. Penetrating and profound as was his intelligence, nothing escaped his observing eye. Perfect tact and a delicate instinct of what was due to all were wedded in this exceptional mind to maturity and education. And this assembly of superior qualities rendered him the most amiable and charming of men, when he chose to show himself as such. The first idea of the journey to Dresden had arisen from Marie Louise's desire to see her family again and to be once more in the midst of her people. The presence of the Emperor of Austria at Dresden necessarily entailed also the presence of the King of Prussia, who was equally the ally of France in the war which was being prepared. Napoleon's principal reason in assembling the kings and the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine had been to show Russia how strong were the bonds which united these different princes to the system of the French Empire. The emperor had not despaired of impressing Russia and of leading this power to less bellicose feelings by means of this display of a close alliance with the sovereigns of the whole of Germany, together with the display of considerable forces. As a matter of fact, and I cannot repeat this too often, Napoleon was entering upon this war with extreme reluctance, and until the very last moment, in his heart of hearts, he hoped to be able to avoid it. Before leaving Paris, the emperor had sent General Narbonne, his aide-de-camp, to St. Petersburg. Having no news of General Narbonne at Dresden, and hearing that the Emperor Alexander had arrived at Vilna, he sent word to Count Lauriston, his ambassador, to proceed to this city and to address himself to the Tsar directly. Napoleon, accordingly, it cannot be denied, fostered a feeble hope that the difficulties might yet be overcome. He loved to think that reflection having enlightened Alexander, the latter would be inclined to withdraw the strong summons addressed by the Russian cabinet to the French government, ordering us to evacuate the territory occupied by our armies before any negotiations or parleys had taken place. General Lauriston was not even able to obtain authorization to go to Vilna. And as to Count Narbonne, he returned to Dresden on May 24th, only 5 days before the emperor's departure. He had been received by the Russian sovereign, but he had not found him at all inclined to make any alteration in his views. The cold and inflexible attitude of this prince, his reserve, his perseverance in unacceptable demands, convinced Napoleon that the Tsar had made up his mind and that he had engaged himself towards England too far to be able to draw back anymore. Unable any longer to deceive himself as to the uselessness of his attempts at reconciliation, the emperor sent orders to Paris that Prince Kurakin's passport should be returned to him. The Duc de Bassano's letter, which was sent with these passports, was so worded that the ambassador of Russia could not but see that the insistence with which he had been asked for them could no longer be considered in any other light than as a declaration of war. In the midst of imposing fetes, drawing rooms, and balls in Dresden, had it not been known that there were stationed around us 500,000 men ready to enter the arena, one would have thought neither of war nor of the great events which were preparing, events in which each one of the actors took a particular and very different interest. Amongst the persons in the suite of the Emperor of Austria was a man vested with the title of Chamberlain, who made himself known in military commands, in diplomatic missions, but who passed unnoticed in the royal and princely crowd. This man was General Count Neipperg. The Empress Marie-Louise saw him there for the first time without attaching the slightest importance to his presence. However, as she was going to the theater room with the emperor, she addressed some words to this general because he happened to be standing in her way. How impenetrable are the designs of God! These three persons, whom the festivities of Dresden had drawn together in such different ranks, were far from suspecting at that time the part which the most humble amongst them was destined to play in the future. On May 29th, the Empress Marie-Louise was the only one of the guests who remained in Dresden. The Emperor Napoleon had left her on that day to join the army. The Emperor and Empress of Austria had set out for Prague the same day themselves to hurry on the preparations for the reception of their daughter and stepdaughter. On the evening before the King of Prussia and the Crown Prince had left to return to Berlin, Marie-Louise remained in Dresden alone for some days and left on June 4th for Prague. Her journey was an interrupted triumph. She was complimented on the Austrian frontier. She was received under triumphal arches and escorted by numerous squadrons of cavalry in full uniform. The emperor and empress came to meet her and conducted her to Prague, which she entered to the sound of cannon and church bells. The civil and religious authorities, the court, and the leading nobility of the provinces were presented to her. The Emperor and Empress of Austria gave precedence to Marie-Louise both at table and in the carriages, and everywhere she was received with the honors which were reserved for the Austrian sovereigns on gala days. His stay at Prague lasted more than 3 weeks, and every day was taken up with banquets, balls, excursions, illuminations, or theatrical performances. Alternate receptions were held at the palace of the Emperor of Austria and at the palace of the Empress Marie-Louise. Nothing was wanting in the honors lavished on Napoleon's wife on Austrian territory. It might have been said that the family of Habsburg, in harmony with fortune, was saluting with a final and splendid homage the man whose star was so soon to wane and at last to go out, to be altogether extinguished. In the midst of these enjoyments, Marie-Louise never for a moment forgot the emperor and used to write to him every day. On June 25th, she wrote the following letter to Napoleon's mother. The emperor is wonderfully well. He is still in the neighborhood of Königsberg, always busy, always on horseback, and all the better for it. The only comfort which I have during his absence is to think that the fatigue which he endures gives me no reason to fear for his health. He writes to me very often, and each day that I receive a letter from him is a day of happiness for me. Nothing can console me for the emperor's absence, not even the presence of all my family. On July 1st, the Empress Marie-Louise left Prague with her father, who accompanied her as far as Carlsbad. And on the 18th, she was back again at St. Cloud. In the meantime, Napoleon visited Glogau, Posen, Dorn, Danzig, and Königsberg in turn. During his stay in the latter city, the emperor held a great review in the plain of Friedland, which reminded him of one of his most splendid triumphs. He inspected the various army corps and conducted them to the Niemen, which was crossed on June 24th. On the 22nd of the same month, a proclamation dated from Wilkowiecki had announced the declaration of the war on Russia. On the 25th of May previously, this power had endeavored to sign the Treaty of Bucharest with the Porte, and on the 29th of the same month had declared all its ports open to ships of all nations, which meant to say that they were open to English trade. On the morrow of the day on which the proclamation of Wilkowiecki had been entered on the order of the day, Napoleon went to reconnoiter in person which point on the Niemen was most favorable to crossing. He put a hood over his coat and placed on his head the forage cap of one of the Polish light cavalry of the guard. 3 bridges were thrown over the river near Kovno by his orders, and it was by these bridges that the army crossed the river in the night of the 23rd June, and during the whole following day, after the Niemen had been crossed and during the march from Kovno to Vilna, no Russian soldiers were met with, except some light troops near the latter town, which was entered by the French without any fighting. The weather had changed suddenly after the crossing of the Niemen, and the rain, which fell in torrents, inundated the roads, and this disorganized all the army transport service. The emperor entered Vilna on June 28th, and he was received there like a liberator and as the restorer of Polish independence. I will now speak of an incident which happened to a Polish squadron and which occurred whilst crossing a small river. I do so because the losses which it is alleged were suffered by these squadrons have been stated with a great deal of exaggeration. The bridge having broken down, the Poles bravely swam across the river, which was much swollen by the rain, in the way practiced by the Tartars. Their loss amounted to one light cavalryman who was carried away by the current, separated from his comrades, and drowned.